Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I haven't really had a chance to sit down and talk in detail about everything that I played at PAX, and it seems like too many sodding games is a great description for a video involving that. I played quite a few things there, and I'd like to talk about each of them, give you a little bit of detail on them, and put a few games on your radar, because of course none of these, with the exception of one, are actually out yet. Regardless of that, quite a few games that I had the chance to play at the event are games that you should be keeping an eye on, because what I saw at that point looked very interesting indeed. Certainly a lot of potential, at least with some of them anyway. So, without further ado, let's kick it off. Here's a game that I play called Beat Cop. Now, this gave me a really big Papers, Please vibe, and the reason it did, I think, is because of its adherence to what would otherwise be mundane procedure in a regular job. Papers, Please was a narratively driven game, but the majority of what you were doing mechanically was going through various procedures, and those procedures on their own could be considered fairly dull. However, in combination with the strict time limits, the stakes that were on the line, keeping your family alive, as well as the questionable moral choices that you'd have to make every now and again, the game became somewhat more than that, and actually became a very enjoyable and sometimes very tense experience. And I think that there are ways to do that in video games, and Beat Cop seems to capture some of that. You find yourself, as you would expect, a regular beat cop, and you are tasked for the most part with giving out parking tickets for various offenses, and you can give them out for the obvious, as in parking in a place that says no parking, parking when the parking meter has run out of time, something a little bit more obscure like a broken light on the back of the car or something like that. And you're given a certain quota, but you're also tasked with solving other crimes and dealing with stuff that is happening in real time around you. So you'll be interacting with the civilians, maybe there'll be an event that happens, you have to sprint over to the other side of the street and deal with this, and try to do all of that within a very, very limited time frame. You're almost overwhelmed by different tasks, and I found that particularly interesting because I was having to make decisions. Well, can I meet my quota by the end of the day? Should I do so honestly? Should I try and bend the rules a little bit? Well, this person needs help. I need to get over here. You have a very limited stamina bar. Whoever this beat cop is, they clearly need to invest a little bit of cardio. But I actually found the game to be quite interesting. I played a couple of days of it, and it consisted of a combination of giving people parking tickets, as well as arresting people occasionally, but very rarely unholstering my gun, for the most part just cuffing people, and of course dealing with various shady characters, getting involved in various different subplots and all that sort of thing, and start getting to learn the neighborhood as well, because it seems like, at least for a certain portion of the game, you're put on the same street, you're put on the same beat every day, so you start to learn the different stores around the area, the different locations, the different potential hotspots for trouble, and you also start to interact with the same characters and build a relationship, and there are various factions in the game that you can either curry favor with or really piss off, which will affect the events of what happens. And you're also dealing with an overbearing commissioner and boss, and your workplace is miserable and all that sort of thing. I actually found it quite compelling. I think it's got some real potential. It's got a potential to have a little bit of edge to it. There were certainly some comedic moments, but also some fairly tense moments, a little bit of racial tension going on there, inherent distrust of the police, and all that sort of thing. Those themes are all in there. So I think this might have some potential if it's properly implemented. It may very well be the next Papers, Please. So keep an eye out for Beat Cop. Here's an interesting little game that caught my eye that I didn't really know anything about before I went into PAX, and that is Antihero, which is a 1 versus 1 digital board game where you run a thieves guild as a master thief. You start in a randomly generated town with a bunch of fog of war and unexplored buildings, and your master thief starts with 2 actions. Eventually, as you upgrade your thief, they'll be able to do more stuff and also recruit minions, and these various kinds of minions will be able to perform various actions, take over various buildings, and so on and so forth. The goal of the game is to win by completing 3 objectives. These can be completed in the form of a bribe to the local government. You can also blackmail the church, yes, indeed. And you can also complete an objective by assassinating an NPC character that will appear in the world at some point. The game, for the most part, seems to be a fairly accessible worker placement and resource management title. You are making decisions as to which buildings to raid, which buildings to steal from, and which buildings to take control of in order to gain particular advantages and upgrades. There's a degree of territory control involved, and what really interested me is the element of the fog of war. Every game is different because the towns are randomly generated, and you have to actively scout in order to not only find the different buildings, but also keep an eye on what the opposing Thieves Guild is doing. If you don't scout effectively, then you can end up being caught off guard by a strategy that you did not see coming. What really attracted me to their very small booth was actually the art style. It reminded me very much of clay titles such as Don't Starve. It has this awesome pencil-driven aesthetic. It's suitably cartoony, but with a little bit of a grim edge to it, and each of the different units is just bursting with character. The game promises asynchronous multiplayer as well as a full campaign, and it looks like they may be looking at crossplay between mobile devices and PC as well, which is always an advantage. I do like having the ability to do that, and the pacing of the game seemed about right for both, honestly. You know, I think I finished the game in about 10 minutes, and I probably could have finished it quicker if I had a full understanding of how the research tree worked and which buildings to take at the right time and which objectives to go for. But as accessible as it seemed to be, it also seemed to have a fairly deep layer of strategy, and I imagine there's going to be significant meta involved in it as well. So that's a one to keep an eye out for if you're into digital board games. I will point out that it didn't really feel like a board game. I know some people are put off by the notion of a board game on a computer or a tablet, saying, you know, what's the point? I'd rather play it physically. Well, it certainly felt like a turn-based strategy game, but it takes a lot of inspiration from worker placement, resource management, and terrain control board games. So it's a nice mix of the two, and I think even if you're not particularly into the board game scene, you will probably find something to like here. It was a game that had a rather large booth at the event and yet seemed fairly unready for show. Let's just put it that way. You see games in various states of readiness when it comes to events like PAX, but you don't necessarily see one that's invested in a booth of that size feel like it's got so many problems. Usually you'd limit the experience to avoid showing most of that. But what we had with Earthfall was a Left 4 Dead clone, and I do use that term very sincerely because it is, that was basically not ready for show. It felt very, very ropey. It felt extremely unresponsive. There was a degree of latency and delay to it. In fact, it was so serious that at times when I shot at an enemy, it looked like the bullet impacted about a second later. You know, it was extremely unresponsive, which made the game feel incredibly unsatisfying, not to mention unbelievably unfinished. And that's a bit of a problem when you're presenting a game that is quite clearly a clone of something else. I don't use the term clone lightly. I think the term clone and reskin in particular is overused and incorrectly applied in many ways. Some people just look at the surface and they say, right, well, this is a clone of something else, even though clearly under the hood, mechanically, it is quite distinct. Unfortunately, when it comes to Earthfall, that is really not true. What you've got is a 4-player, first-person co-op versus environment game in which you have to complete various objectives in order to end the level. Sounds pretty familiar, right? Well, you're also against a horde of things. In this case, they are aliens as opposed to zombies, but they act like zombies. They are not distinct in their behavior. There are slightly less of them, certainly, than Left 4 Dead, since that very much goes for the horde approach, but the way that they act is zombie-like. Not particularly smart, they'll just run right at you and try and melee you. Of course, the game also features a number of special aliens, which are, again, it would appear ripped right out of Left 4 Dead. There's one that will jump on you and will keep hitting you until somebody kills it or knocks it off you. There's another one which will explode in a cloud of gas, etc., etc. I think you get the idea. And of course, there are various tiers of weapons that you can pick up for the 4 different characters. The only real distinctions that I can make other than the setting for this game are in terms of the pacing and the form of objectives on display. I felt that Left 4 Dead put a lot of emphasis on traveling through the level and not staying in one place for too long. This game seemed like it put a little bit more emphasis on defending an area. There was some movement, absolutely. We started off the level locating a van which wouldn't start, so we pushed it to a local garage. We were then able to put up some barricades, defend said van, and we had to run around the level trying to bring back parts to get the van working again. What that meant was we had a sort of central base of operations for the level, and we had to range out from there, as opposed to going from point A to point B to point C to point D in a line and traveling towards the end goal, which is what Left 4 Dead often feels like. So there's maybe a little killing flaw in there, not too much. I emphasize that it is very much a Left 4 Dead clone. Just in terms of the fact that they don't mind you being stationary for a while, they don't mind you going back to a specific place and defending it. And the addition of barricades was a nice little add-on. It helped ensure that not every single doorway in that garage was a vulnerability, at least temporarily at any rate. There was also a 3D printer that could be tasked with giving you various guns and gadgets. There was a mounted weapon that we were able to get out of that. I can't really remember whether or not it required any sort of currency. I think it was really just time. You picked what you wanted out of the 3D printer. There was a selection of different things you could get, and then it would take time to print it, which meant that you actually had a rather large supply of guns in comparison to something like Left 4 Dead, although the game is conspicuously lacking any sort of real melee ability. So even though there were a decent variety of firearms on display, without the melee weapons, it felt like it had less than Left 4 Dead did. It was just so very samey and yet so horribly unresponsive. I think if it was a clone in a different setting, but it felt good and all the mechanics were right and the gunplay felt tight and the enemies responded suitably to being riddled with bullets, then I would probably be more entertained by it, but it was clearly not ready for show. And that massive delay on the response and the clear frame rate problems that the game was suffering, as well as uninspired enemy design, left me thinking, well, what place does this game really have in the market? Because I think Left 4 Dead is probably still king of that genre, and I don't see Earthfall dethroning it anytime soon without serious improvements before release. Moving on to something a little bit more positive, in fact, what I would say is the most intriguing game of the show, that being Clay's brand new title, Oxygen Not Included. Now, Clay is known for dancing around the genres somewhat, as well as having a distinctive art style that is different for every game that they do. I know, that sounds like a contradiction, and yet you can see a Clay game coming a mile off without each art style and each aesthetic being identical. Tricky thing to do, really. I actually asked them at the booth how they managed that, and their answer was they just have a lot of very experienced artists that used to work on cartoons a lot. So they were able to bring a certain unique flair without using the same art style every time. It was identifiable, and yet not identical. Pretty damn smart. Now, the title that we're looking at is a colony management game this time around, so it has survival elements to it, because of course you're trying to keep your colonists alive, and yet there is much more in terms of resource gathering and construction. You're building a working colony, but you're doing so with so-called duplicants, which are cloned colonists. They're 3D printed, basically, and they're really bad at their jobs, incredibly bad. It's like trying to teach puppies how to successfully mine nuclear material without killing themselves. It's tricky, you know, you are herding cats. It is a herding cat game, and you're doing so on a hostile planet. It's designed to be very much a game where losing is fun. You are expected to die horribly, everything is expected to eventually go horribly wrong, and even if things do seem to be going well, you can pretty much guarantee that one of the colonists is going to ruin it by getting a little bit too entitled. While initially the colonists are absolutely useless, they will eventually train in various skills and you can specialize them in certain things. So you can have someone do nothing but cooking to become the master chef of the colony. The problem is, as they get better at things, they tend to get a little bit cocky. So they get demanding. Oh, I will not cook for you unless you get me the greatest new entertainment system and you build me a bedroom with all the modern conveniences and all that sort of thing. And of course that costs resources and it can be difficult to handle. Now, that's already right up my alley. I'm looking for a management game. I'm looking for a little bit of Theme Hospital, but with a little bit of Dwarf Fortress tossed in there for good measure, and it seems like this game may very well have that. But what really got my attention was the level of simulation that was going on in the game. they simulate all sorts of different things, from temperature to contagions to oxygen and CO2 levels around the actual map itself. And you have to deliberately keep an eye on that and properly manage it, because otherwise you could have colonists that suffocate. And it goes down to such a detailed level that having colonists breathe too much because they're engaged in hard labor in a small enclosed environment can actually suck up all the O2 in the area, and it can oversaturate the area with carbon, which of course will cause the colonists to get more tired and eventually pass out. You can do all sorts of things like manage that with pipes and fumigation and air conditioning systems, and you can do the same thing with temperature and all sorts of different things like that. The developers described the ability to do things like power your colony via a lava pool, using it to actually heat up water, a real body of water which would generate steam, which you could then, of course, drive into turbines. And you do this all through pipe networks. Like, those are physical entities and agents within the world that move around. That's not simply an abstract mechanic. It's one that really works in the way that you would expect it to, which gives it this very tactile and intuitive, logical feel, assuming, of course, that you understand the basic physics behind it all. The whole thing seemed incredibly intriguing. It is going into early access over the next few months. I'll probably avoid the early access and just wait for the full version, because I think that this game is going to get more and more interesting the more systems are layered on top of another. And of course, at early access, you're missing parts of it. No doubt about that. So I'll probably hold on until that point, but if you're looking for something that is a colony management game with an element of survival to it, and you're into the whole idea of losing as fun, then Oxygen Not Included looks like it may very well be yet another great Clay game. I'm not exactly sure if there has been a bad Clay game. If there has, I haven't played it. A game that I really enjoyed a few years ago, but was certainly not without its flaws, went by the name of Hand of Fate, which was a deck-building game combined with a little bit of roguelite alongside some 3D brawling, which was in the style of Arkham, yet fairly low rent in that regard, as are, unfortunately, many games that attempt to clone a system where you have a lot of very experienced and also very expensive animation talent behind it. That system doesn't really work if you can't match up to that AAA level of quality. And as such was the case with Hand of Fate, unfortunately. The weakest part of the game was also kind of the meat of it, in that you would encounter various creatures as you drew cards against the dealer, and then you would be put into a 3D brawl with said creatures, and it was okay, it just wasn't particularly phenomenal. Now, that being the weak point of the game, you would hope they would improve that in the sequel, and that's exactly what they did with Hand of Fate 2. The game keeps its iconic dealer, this rather shady and mysterious character that you sit opposite to as he deals you cards in your fairly randomly generated adventure, which is great. That really maintains the character of the game. I think that missing out on that would be missing out on what kept a lot of people intrigued when it came to that title. But it takes the brawling aspect of the game and makes it a hell of a lot better. It's expanded the move sets, it's expanded the weapon sets, more importantly, because the first game really consisted of nothing but sword and board for the most part. It wasn't necessarily a sword, but it was a one-handed weapon with a shield. You can have dual-wielded weapons now, you can have two-handed weapons, and these different weapon sets have different abilities, different move sets, different passives, and all that sort of thing, which is great, because you can have different sets of dual-wielded knives and two-handed hammers and so on and so forth that have a distinct feel, and you can certainly identify a weapon that you're most comfortable with, and yet you can get different variations of that weapon. And the acquisition of loot in Hand of Fate was one of the more entertaining aspects of it, but it was limited because of those limited combat styles available. That's no longer the case. You can also add a follower to the mix, which is an NPC character, and you can use that follower to really make up for your weaknesses and specialize as a character. They wanted to expand and emphasize the deck building aspect of the game. They wanted it to really be a set of deck building puzzles as opposed to just taking whatever new cards you unlocked and rolling with them. So they're emphasizing the deck building aspect and the importance of that this time around by giving you scenarios with very specific requirements that may very well require you to completely rebuild your deck. So think a little bit more Hearthstone adventure this time around in terms of the different encounters. You won't just be able to take one deck and dominate the whole game with it. You're gonna have to vary things up. The little campaign that I played was against a character called the Reaper, and this is a man who apparently has an arrow that never misses and will do 100 damage to you when you encounter him. So you have to get your base health above 100. You have to, of course, include cards in your deck that you will encounter that will allow you to do that, and yet, of course, balance the deck in a way that you get all the items you need to truly take on the encounter. I was very happy with it. I felt the combat was much improved. There were improvements in terms of effects, graphics. The animation quality was a lot higher. It felt tighter. It felt more impactful and responsive. And, of course, its iconic dealer and the style of having these physical cards weave through the air and land on the table with all sorts of magical curios surrounding you as you play this game against this mysterious dealer is still present. So I think this will be a marked improvement on Hand of Fate by the looks of it from what I've played, and as a result I'm looking forward to seeing the final product. Now here's an interesting one that is probably flying under most people's radars. It goes by the name of A Church in the Darkness. I hadn't heard of it before the show, and the reason it intrigued me was because it dealt with a subject that is generally not approached in games all that often, and that's the idea of religious cults, specifically real-life religious cults in the 60s and 70s. Now, this is a stealth game that tasks you to go into a cult environment, essentially into a compound in another country, and locate your nephew. The interesting thing about this is that they generate the cult in a different way every time, and it is a game in which you're not entirely sure whether the cult is there for good reasons or bad. You're not sure what the motivation is, and you're actually not really sure whether or not your nephew actually wants to be there. Perhaps he's being held against his will, perhaps he genuinely believes in what's going on, perhaps he's been brainwashed. You just don't know until you get in there, and you're supposed to infiltrate the compound in a stealth fashion and find information about the cult, and of course locate your nephew and figure out whether or not the cult is up to no good. You can take violent or non-violent means to do so, or of course you can just sneak around the place, information gathering, disguises, their factors. There was an interesting part in the demo in which I was captured, and it was not an automatic game over, and based on the actions that I had taken prior to that, I was able to get a second shot at the level because I hadn't gone around and killed a bunch of cult members. I had actually really not interacted with them much at all. The cult leader decided to give me mercy, and I was able to get out of the cage and go and attempt the thing again. And the cult leader's personalities are supposed to change on a playthrough by playthrough basis. I think that it's got a very unique bit of subject matter, and potentially the thematic element of the game could be very strong if it's well written, and if there's enough variety in it. The stealth mechanics as it stood were fairly basic stuff. It was vision cones and sneaking and stealth takedowns and all that sort of thing. But the subject matter and the ever-changing narrative is what I think is going to interest me a lot with that title, and what's probably going to keep people coming back for multiple playthroughs. Certainly a unique-looking game. Also had a chance to check out Alien Trap's new title. They're the folks behind Capsized and Apotheon, if you remember that. I've looked at both of those on the channel at some point. This game is called Cryptarch, and this is a title in which you play a mercenary/space privateer that is tasked with infiltrating and destroying derelict ships, and you do that through the means of having a fricking space mech, which is always a nice thing to have. I think that's a appealing part of the game, certainly. It's a procedurally generated 2D twin stick, basically, in which you have to gear out your mech, and you have to do so with the money that you've earned from previous missions. So there's a real economic element to it. Do you want to go in light, or do you want to go in there with really expensive gear? Because quite literally, every bullet you shoot is going to cost you some money. So you often have to pick and choose your objectives. Some of the ships are so massive that you will not be able to take everything out. You simply will not have the resources to do it. So you have to prioritize the various sub-objectives, loot opportunities, and main objectives of each vessel. And the order in which you do that is certainly going to be a factor. There's going to be a great deal of decision-making involved there. If you don't turn off certain security measures, they can become a real pain in the arse for you later on, but maybe you just don't want to dedicate the explosives to eliminating that. Maybe it's too far over the other side of the ship. I mean, some of these things are bloody massive, and there are multiple entry points. You can choose whichever entry point you want to go in and start the mission. So I think it's got some intriguing elements to it. The economic management of it and the overall campaign is what interests me. The gameplay is fairly standard. You know, it's certainly something that's been done before. It feels relatively good if you're into 2D twin sticks, but there's nothing that's going to set the world on fire in that respect. There's nothing mind-blowingly innovative, but it is that overall campaign gameplay and that mercenary feel that's going to interest me. And you're also able to unlock different default ships and loadouts on a run-through by run-through basis, so you've got a lot of diversity there, and you'll be able to buy new weapons or loot some upgraded stuff and slap it onto your piecemeal, jury-rigged privateer mech. There's definitely an appeal there, I think. If they do that right, if they give you that sort of Firefly feel, then I think that's going to have quite a bit of longevity. Now, while I was over near the Cryptarch booth, I actually swung by the folks from Butterscotch Shenanigans. You may have heard of the game that I played over there, which is, of course, Crashlands. It's been out for quite some time. It's one of the best iOS games that's currently available. It's also available on Android, if I recall correctly. And it is a Don't Starve-esque 2D sci-fi survival game with much more emphasis on questing and combat as opposed to pure survival. The game's available on PC as well and actually has crossplay so that you can port your save from mobile device to PC and vice versa. And they've been innovating quite a bit in terms of the crossplay and cross-platform functionality. They've been working on a system which allows you to design new content for the game and actually create your own stories and levels and all that sort of thing, but do it on either a mobile device or on PC. You can add contributors to the mix, so you can have a collaborative project that everybody can work on. You can change, through a very simple scripting system, the different attributes of enemies and bosses. You could turn an enemy into a quest giver. You can add full-on dialogue and cutscenes and all that sort of thing. So it seems to me like they're generating the ability to create custom stories without any real programming knowledge and also share that across multiple platforms. There are not all that many games on mobile that let you do anything of the sort. In fact, I can barely think of any that do. So this is really quite innovative, and Crashlands on its own is a great game. If you're looking for something that's a little bit like Don't Starve, but you thought, you know what, I prefer a little bit more combat and a little bit less survival and craziness, or maybe I prefer a sci-fi theme or an interesting sense of humor. Well, you know, Crashlands has all of that, so it looks like that's going to be a really great addition to what's already a great game on both PC and on mobile, so it's really cool to check that out. Now, last but by no means least, the game that I was very excited to see but a little bit wary of was, of course, Battletech, which is the revival of the classic MechWarrior universe, and it's by Harebrained Schemes, who have had, I think, more hits than misses, honestly. They did a great job reviving Shadowrun. I think most people would agree with that. But they stumbled a bit recently with the release of Necropolis, which did not really go down so well. I did not like it. I thought it was a big missed opportunity. It was underdeveloped, needed 6 more months in the oven. But Shadowrun, certainly Dragonfall and Hong Kong were excellent games. So them getting their hands on another FASA IP was something that I was excited about, and we haven't seen a real MechWarrior game in quite some time, outside, of course, the free-to-play variants, MechWarrior Tactics, which shut down, and MechWarrior Online, which is not bad, but has an awful lot of problems. I think a lot of us were looking for a full single-player experience with a real campaign, and that's what Battletech is. It is a turn-based, campaign-focused MechWarrior game. You have a lance of mechs, you have persistence, you have pilots that will level up, you have pilots that will gain new skills and attributes, you will acquire new equipment as a mercenary team, you will be able to interact not only with mechs but also with ground vehicles from that universe, which was a nice little inclusion in games like Mech Commander, big fan of that. And the tactics layer seems really, really solid. Instead of using a hex or grid-based system, they simply use radiuses, so you have certain ranges depending on the speed of your mech. You can force your mech to sprint, which will of course disable its weapons, potentially overheat the thing. Mechs with jump jets will be able to get up to higher ground, which you can exploit for direct fire. You can also use indirect fire with certain weapons. There's a wide variety of weapons from the MechWarrior universe available, as well as a wide variety of mechs that all have their different roles. And what I really enjoyed about it was the flexibility of the light mechs. They had so much mobility. I was able to easily flank and get behind enemy units, which would allow me to unload into their rear armor. I could use them for scouting, and they also had a big advantage in terms of when they can move, because the game uses an initiative system, which allows you to move different classes and weights of mechs at different times. The slower mechs have to move at a specific time, they get less initiative, but the faster mechs get a lot more flexibility, and that's very important for scouting, locating the enemy, getting a good bead on them, and making sure that you don't expose yourself to too much fire. The mission that I played felt really good, it felt suitably tactical, and they've already really nailed the animations. So it looks good, it looks modern. Unloading an Alpha Strike from an Atlas into an enemy Shadowcat felt absolutely awesome. The mech just rocked under the weight of fire, weapons blazing. Yeah, I think this might very well be good. I certainly hope so, because full disclosure, backed this damn thing on Kickstarter, and I don't want a disappointment. I've had too many disappointments already when it comes to the Battletech universe. This one is looking like it may very well be the right course of action for the series, which has been certainly faltering in recent years. So I was very happy with what I saw there. There you go, folks. There's the description of the kind of things that I looked at PAX, outside of a couple of the larger Ubisoft games, which will get their own separate videos at a slightly later date. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means, do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there. And a reminder that Shoutcraft Kings will air live on twitch.tv/TotalBiscuit Saturday, the 17th of September at 8 a.m. Eastern. Please do go and check that out. It's going to be an awesome StarCraft 2 King of the Hill event with $5,000 on the line for the world's top players, with mystery invites, and every map counts. I'm going to be casting it along with Ben the Muslim Baker. It's going to be fantastic. Looking forward to it. And if you miss any of the VODs, they'll be available on youtube.com/TotalBiscuit, which is my second channel dedicated to StarCraft 2. I'll see you next time.